Lord, speak to us of your coming, of your presence among us. Amen. I could begin this sermon with Happy New Year. There are so many different New Years in our world and in our life. Obviously, the calendar one in January, the Jewish New Year in the autumn, we would think. The Muslim New Year, which can move around a bit, but similar. The Chinese New Year, the academic New Year, probably 1st of September, unless you're in Scotland, in which case it's August. But don't forget the Church's year, the liturgical year, which begins on Advent Sunday, 4 Sundays before Christmas, because that is an important one. It structures a lot of our worship and our teaching and our reading of the Bible. And it helps us to get the two big chunks of the year, the first half of the liturgical year, roughly end of November, beginning of December to end of May-ish, where we're looking at the story of Jesus' life and his doings, his future doings, as well as his past doings. And then the second chunk of the year, all the Sundays after Trinity, the teaching of Jesus. And today it all begins, Advent Sunday. And we move to a different gospel. The last liturgical year, we've been working through Matthew's gospel, occasional looks elsewhere. This liturgical year, we mainly look through Mark's gospel. And that's what we're doing today in our gospel passage, which is Mark 13, verses 24 to the end. And of course, it's an Advent reading. It's part of the section which in Mark is shorter than in Matthew or Luke, the section where Jesus is talking about end of the world type stuff, or second coming, or final judgment, or however you want to put it. But let's stick for a moment with the theme of Advent, that this is the beginning of a new liturgical year. It's a new start in lots of ways. It should be. And just want to pause to ask that question: why do we not begin with Christmas? Advent isn't preparing for Christmas. It's the beginning of the whole liturgical year. I know in normal times, a bit less so with coronavirus around, in normal times, Christmas lights and school visits and carol services and so on happen from the very beginning of December. And that's bound to happen in the world we're in. But that isn't why Advent Sunday happens. It isn't what Advent is about. Advent gives the context for the whole Christian life. The whole context is Jesus is coming again. This is his kingdom. He is coming as judge. He is coming as Lord. The whole of our life here is preparing to meet him when he comes. And that's why we begin with Advent Sunday, to prepare us to meet Jesus when he comes. And then we get the details of his life and his death and his resurrection, his sending of the Spirit and all his teaching. Advent is where we begin, because it's where the new life is promised. And in a sense, and it makes sense of our reading too, it's all hangs on the resurrection. We could say, and it is, Easter is the pinnacle, the peak of the Christian year. Everything else depends on that. Jesus is alive. Jesus has conquered death. And when we read passages like today's about judgment and warning and so on, we need to remember that they're in the context of Jesus' resurrection. And they were written to early Christians for whom the resurrection was the center of everything, as it should be for us. Advent is Advent Sunday. Sunday is Resurrection Day. Every week we celebrate the resurrection on Sunday, and everything else follows from that and is subservient to that, even the return of Christ. So as we think of Advent, the return of Christ, it's in the context of the fact that he is risen, he is alive. He is the Lord of life and death, and the one who gives new life. And so we come to a difficult reading. And part of understanding the reading today is remembering that, among other things, Jesus is a prophet. And he fits in with the line of the great prophets of the Jewish religion, who sometimes talk about things in the future, sometimes a long way ahead, sometimes a little way ahead, sometimes are making, you might almost call political predictions, as in this case, sometimes harder to understand, sometimes what we call apocalyptic, the revelation or latter parts of Daniel type writings, which are full of dreams and visions and really hard to grasp hold of. And there's a bit of that in Jesus' teaching here. Imagine the scene. This is just the very end of his life. He's probably, as it were, sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. Those who've been to the Holy Land know that that's a familiar place to be. And he's looking and thinking to the end and the destruction of Jerusalem. Not so long, 30-something years after his life, not very long at all after the Gospels were written. And the Gospel writers are recalling Jesus' predictions. This is going to end. This city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The uprisings, rebellions of the Jews against Rome will not be tolerated forever, and it will be dreadful. And Jesus sees that as an image of the end of the world. And so he talks about that time as the stars beginning to fall from heaven, because Jerusalem is God's presence with his people. It's the whole heart of the Old Testament. And that will go to the whole old order as we know it will disappear. The whole way of God being present with his people in man-made buildings, in particular places, will all disappear. And the destruction of Jerusalem is the start of that. But it's not just a death, is it? It's a new life. Because, as I've said, it all depends on the heart of the Christian year and the Christian life is the resurrection. The old will be swept away, but the new will come. And in fact, the new has already begun with the resurrection of Jesus. But there will be suffering in those days. And then the Son of Man will come in clouds with great power and glory and will send his angels to gather the elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. He will gather his people together by his angels. It's all very apocalyptic, end of the world sort of language. And then a bit of warning, little bit of warning or encouragement perhaps. Be ready. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. You know from the fruit and the state of the tree where you are in the seasons. You know when summer's coming. You know when it's time for harvest. Well, there'll be a harvest of this earth. And we don't know exactly when, but there will be, and we need to be prepared. Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Even heaven, the whole thing will be swept away. It'll be new heaven and new earth, not just get rid of earth and take us to heaven, something much more spectacular than that. New heavens and new earth. Quite astonishing promises. And we're to be ready. And the meaning of Advent and the meaning of the whole church's year is we're to be ready to meet our God. And we read the stories about Jesus and we read the teaching of Jesus through the church year to help us to be ready to meet him when he comes, to be living as he wants us to be watchful and waiting and alert and active in his service, to be building his kingdom on earth as a preliminary, a taster for when heaven and earth are swept away and there's a new heaven and a new earth and a perfect kingdom. Until then, we're to be about the business of the kingdom and we're to be alert and ready. But the final little section of today's gospel verses 32 to the end are saying, as we're ready, as we're looking for his coming, Don't be daft and don't try and work out the times and the chronology and the dates and have the second coming on your calendar, because it'll happen suddenly. It'll happen without warning. Don't pay too much attention to all the signs of the moon turning to blood and all the picture language of vision preaching. Those aren't to give you a date. Those are to tell you that something cataclysmic and astonishing is going to happen. Stars falling from heaven and so on. It's to tell you that the whole order will disappear and there'll be a new order based on Jesus and his resurrection and new life and a new heaven and a new earth. But we don't know when it'll happen. We're to be ready. We're to be ready. We're to be active in service. We're to be kingdom building. We're to be praising and worshiping. We're to be witnessing to Jesus and sharing him with others. All those things. And we're to be living in this world for him day by day through this new church year and beyond. And we're to be ready, to be alert for his coming, though we don't know when it will be. That's the message of Advent. That's the message of this gospel passage, that all this will be swept away, all the things in which we might be tempted to put our trust, whether it's a literal Jerusalem, whether it's a church building, whether it's our certainties and securities of this wonderful and broken world, all the things we might put our trust in will be swept away. And even all our efforts to build kingdom in this world and to make things better, ultimately will be swept away, because a perfect kingdom will come in. That's not to say we shouldn't make those efforts, because we're called to serve Jesus in others here and now. Of course we should be making those kingdom efforts, because they're signs of something yet more remarkable, which will break in, or which will dawn into our world with the return of Christ. Be ready, be alert, be at work for him, be worshipping and praising and witnessing. Don't waste your time trying to work out when it'll be. Just be ready for his coming. Amen.